Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson at Williams College. How are you doing, Galen?
Good man. A lot of hoops going on right now.
A
So,
lot of
yeah.
would you say that it's crazy? Would you say that it's madness?
I mean, some might say that, except no Cinderellas this year. So,
Okay.
None.
Yeah,
pretty,
no
pretty much,
surprises.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have our other friend here, Professor Ryan Weldzius at Villanova in
And we are
Philly.
also not in the tournament this year.
Bogus because
You can deal with it. You've had a pretty solid run for the last decade. So,
Two championships in a decade, not bad.
yeah.
not bad at all. I was going to say Villanova is usually pretty good, but maybe they're reloading, they're restocking, whatever you want to call it this year.
We'll go with reloading. We'll go with reloading.
All
Yeah, they
right.
just fired their head coach, and so they're gonna be trying to find someone good over the next year or so,
Yeah,
or I
Well,
guess
got
all
it.
less than
right.
a year.
I do have to ask, like, what is going on with the Bulls? Like, why? What are they doing? Are they just aiming to be perennially like 39 and 43? Or what is the long-term plan?
Yeah,
I
Ryan's
think
from
that's
Chi-Town. So by
I
the
think
way,
that's pretty spot on. I should clarify from the suburbs of Chi-Town. I'm that guy. Uh,
Okay.
Listen, Galen, I have not been following NBA at all. I have been following the destruction and slow destruction. I should say, no, the quick destruction of our country,
oh, the
um,
Okay.
United States.
which I think we're going to
Okay.
talk about today. But yeah, I got nothing
Yes.
for you on the Bulls.
Hey, you seem to be paying attention to the important stuff, so we can start there.
Right.
Yeah,
It's just so exhausting.
it's a lot. So Ryan is here to talk to us about tariffs because he's assistant professor of political science with a specialization in IPE, right? International political economy. It's mostly what you do, trade
Yep.
stuff, international monetary stuff. That's awesome. We have lots of questions for you because we don't understand what the hell is going on. And Global Tantrum is the show where we try to explain to ourselves what the hell is going on. And getting some expertise on here in this area would be very good. We're security studies guys, right? So, bombs and bullets, not so much dollars and trade. So we're
I'm
very
a
happy
viewer
to
of the
have you
show.
on.
I know the stuff you guys cover. This is a little
Yeah,
bit different.
a little bit different, but like pretty important. Warren Buffett recently described tariffs as a quote unquote semi act of war. And he knows a lot about money and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yeah, he sure
interesting.
does.
Yeah. Before we get to that, though, I feel as though we should delve into one of the major news items that has crossed our path
What
recently.
could that be, Steve?
Yeah. So there was a chat with some administration folks on an app called Signal, which is an encrypted chat app. They were talking about bombing the Houthis in Yemen, and they let a reporter in, and not just any reporter, right, guys?
It's just so dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who's like,
Yes.
I don't know, if we want to just be safe, can we say easily top 25? Like,
Oh, yeah. No question about that.
like probably top 10
Yeah.
globally famous reporter to be on
Hmm.
the classified, I guess, classified uh, chat thread on Signal. So
Yeah.
I'm sure Hillary Clinton is having a field day reading about this right now.
Yeah. But her emails, like, well,
But
it,
her emails.
yeah. So just to recap this nonsense super quickly, they were discussing classified war plans in a unsecure group chat. We're talking about Pete Hegseth. We're talking about Mike Waltz, respectively, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor. A bunch of other important people were in there too. JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States.
People in
So,
Moscow at the
oh
time.
yeah, right. They were
uh,
lurking. Yeah.
really playing
So
all the hits.
And
all the
then
hit.
the pre-planned talk in front of Congress the next day, like that was already on the schedule, and then possibly perjuring themselves in that Q&A. It's
Okay.
just, it's so dumb.
I guess I'm not up on the very latest.
Who
So
would have thought appointing people who have no administrative background into these really important jobs would blow up in their faces so beautifully?
yeah, well, I'm looking at this and I'm
Nobody
like,
could have predicted
we
this.
know that for the second Trump administration, the main criterion for hiring is willingness to do whatever he wants with no questions asked. And everything else is like a distant second or maybe not even on the radar, right?
Hmm.
And that includes competence, propriety, probity, wisdom. experience, like intelligence, any of these other things. And I think we're seeing that play out in real time with stuff like this. Now, there are two kind of sets of consequences to this. One set of consequences is internal, one is external. Let's discuss external first. How does this make the rest of the world see the United States, including, our former allies in Europe and everywhere else?
Is former already official? Like, is that
maybe not official, but like we're certainly taking steps in that direction, wouldn't you say?
like estranged or
Yeah.
estranged adjacent allies? I mean,
Fused,
yeah,
maybe?
it's pretty simple. It makes us look really incompetent because it's really fucking incompetent.
Well,
That's
yeah,
kind
it
of
makes us look incompetent, but like there's also the stuff they were talking about, which is how like Hegseth was like, the Europeans are pathetic, right? In capital letters. And Vance is like, I don't want to bail them out again, in reference to bombing the Houthis, because the US doesn't have much trade through the Red Sea, which is the choke point that the Houthis are choking at the moment with their drones and missiles. But Europe has 40% of its trade go through the Red Sea. So the idea being America first. This is not America first. This is Europe first. Why are we even doing this?
If I was going back to when I was like 18 years old and I was like a pretty conservative young guy, I remember I went to West Point. I had probably the same mentality of these people who are now running these offices without any good education at that point. So it would make sense for 18-year-old me to think the things that they're thinking. For these people to be in their jobs and still thinking these things, that cooperation doesn't matter, that we should attack our closest allies, it's baffling. It's absolutely baffling. Like, I really don't understand how dumb these people really are. And I don't think it's a long game. I really think that they just have like a really bad understanding of how the world works.
Yeah, I think the most
you want to tell us how you really feel?
Yeah, most charitable interpretation.
Doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well,
man.
it does still matter. That's the troubling part. No, I think they're committed ideologues. That's the most charitable spin you could put on this. And yes, they are incompetent. This is incompetence of the highest order. Like, even if you are in favor of America First agenda, it's like there's simply no way you could look at this and be like, oh, this is fine. You guys are doing a great job by doing this. It's like nobody believes that. Literally nobody believes that, or they shouldn't anyway. Okay, that's external. What about internal? Like, is this going to result in firings? Is this going to result in changes?
I don't think so.
Doesn't seem like it, right?
No. I mean,
what's the big guy said? What's the big guy saying about this? It's cool.
I actually don't know.
I
mean,
do know.
He's been on the offensive, basically.
Yeah.
But when is he not?
Yeah. Trump's what they like to call a counterpuncher. Reportedly, he's very upset internally. Externally, he's attacking the press because he always does that. So Mike Waltz has taken the fall for this. He says this is, my fault entirely. And Trump has said Waltz is a good man and he's learned his lesson. Let's move on.
And I expect that will be the extent of it. I don't think there's going to be 100%. Any accountability for it. I mean, I can't get over how amazing it is. Now, they shouldn't have been communicated on Signal anyway, but at least it has the virtue of being encrypted. But putting one of the most famous journalists on the thread, it's like having something in a very locked up safe, but then delivering it to the Atlantic with the key to it with the classified war plans. It's like such an amazing contrast.
And they were talking about straight up OPSEC stuff. It's like, these planes are going to bomb these targets at this time. And the emojis were flying. It's crazy.
And apparently Goldberg at first thought it was misinformation. And then he was like, oh no, shit, this is the real stuff.
Yeah. So predictably, they're coming after Goldberg a little bit. Goldberg has maintained plausible deniability. He stayed there until it was clear that it wasn't a joke, and then he left immediately and documented everything. I don't know what they're going to be able to do to him, if anything. Hopefully nothing.
I said it wasn't top secret. And so he's like, okay, if that's the case, then I will share it.
Yes. There you go.
Yeah.
And so that's been done.
I watch legal dramas. They're fine. He's fine.
They're fine. They're totally fine.
It's now a realistic portrayal of American life.
Well, hey, they say this is the reality TV presidency, so it's of a piece, right? Okay, let's put a pin in that.
Yeah.
And talk about what we actually came to talk about, which is tariffs. And Ryan, can you kick us off? Like, let's be super remedial. What is a tariff? Let's begin there.
Tax. I think the Democrats actually have done a good job on saying like this is a tax. It's all it's what it is. It is a tax. Donald Trump has he has raised taxes more than any president in our history, in our living history, right? This is a major tax on consumers. I don't understand how it's still being discussed by people in the administration as being paid for by other countries. It's absolutely baffling. So how this works, you import a good from abroad. Like let's look at iPhone. You import this from abroad. The company that's importing it, they pay a tax if there is a tariff on that good. They pay that, and it's then revenue that's given to the government. But this is paid for by
Apple,
American companies. In this case, it would
Yeah.
be from Apple, right? They're buying it from India or from Taiwan or China, where it's coming from, and they're paying a tax on that good. And then that then gets transmitted into the revenue through not through the IRS, but through the Treasury. But it's paid for by Americans. And then they don't just eat that cost. They then pass that cost on to consumers. And we know that this actually happens. So in I think it was 2017, 2018, Trump put a tax on the import of washing machines from Korea. I think it was just in general on washing machines, but they're mostly coming from Korea. It
By
was
the
a
way,
20 tax.
yeah, we have a LG washing machine, so this hits close to home. Please
Okay,
continue. Yes.
so it was a 20% tax. The pass-through of that onto prices ended up being about 17%, right? So prices went up about 17 or 18% on all of those washing machines, which means that if you purchase a washing machine like yourself, an LG product coming out of Korea, you paid that tax, right? It's not the importer does pay it, but then they want their money back, and so they increase prices. The other side of it is other companies in the US saw the prices of these goods going up for their competitors, and they said, why don't we do the same thing? And so they did. And so they also increased their prices. So prices in general went up. So at a time, sorry, I get really fired up about this. It's just dumb. Everything about this is dumb.
Let us have it, dude.
Like
this is good. This is pure gold.
The stated goals of the administration never align with the means with which to get there. They often do the opposite thing, at least in economics, which is just baffling. So in this case, what's going to happen is it's going to lead to an increase in prices. Donald Trump arguably won because there was high inflation and didn't do a good job of selling the point that they were going to be the ones to fix it. He is going to increase inflation through these tariffs, through these taxes. It's bound to happen.
Okay, and what is the argument that administration would make for imposing tariffs? Because this is to achieve policy goals, supposedly, right? What are those policy goals?
So in this case, they're trying to coerce other countries into giving better deals for the US. I think that's the big thing. But you guys as security guys know about issue linkage. This is the first time in a while that trade has been used to link issues, right? So we're not putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico because we're really worried about their imports. We have a free trade agreement with them. Our businesses are heavily integrated in those economies. All the things we're importing from Mexico are mostly things that we actually exported to Mexico. They've had some value added to it, and then they're exported back to the US, right? They're imported. We're heavily integrated in these markets. So they don't care about, the deficits per se with these countries. They're linking it to the idea of fentanyl, which is, we'll get back to why this matters for Canada because it shouldn't, and immigration.
Right.
So they're trying to bully other countries into certain policy goals using tariffs. Remember, Trump says he's the tariff man. A lot like McKinley said, he's the tariff man.
Yeah, McKinley said that 130 years ago, right?
Yeah,
more or less.
At a time that tariffs, would actually have a big impact. And also back with McKinley, so we're all going to be all over the place here. Yeah. Back in McKinley's time, this was a major source of revenue for our government. We didn't have an income tax. And so all of our revenue, I shouldn't say all, in McKinley's time, it was about 50% of revenue was coming from these taxes on imports. It made sense. In a global economy now, where we're heavily integrated in trade, but also in finance, it really doesn't make sense. So the main thing is issue linkage in the case of Mexico and Canada. In the case of the European Union, It seems like he does care about imports of goods, cars, wine, things like that. But it really just seems like he has a grudge with the Europeans. I think it all goes back to defense spending with NATO. He's maybe using this as a way to coerce them to spend more. Keep in mind who was at the inauguration. It wasn't the UAW, right? It's not Sean Fain from the UAW. It was obviously Elon Musk, but also Mark Zuckerberg, Bezos, the heads of these major tech companies. In Europe, they're taxed differently than they're taxed here. All right.
Yeah.
Trade in digital services, and there's a digital services tax in the European Union that it looks like Trump is trying to unwind for American companies. Does that help the manufacturing worker in Reading, Pennsylvania? No, not at all. Does it help the billionaires? Yes, very much. So again,
Maybe.
the stated
Yeah.
goal is to help out workers, and I think we'll talk more about that. But the means to get there is just the complete opposite of what you should be doing.
So, all right. So before we move on to if we were going to like put the best face on this or what they're actually trying to accomplish with manufacturing and things like that, I just want to repeat this back to you because
Yeah,
you calling it basically a tax on consumers. I just want to make sure the logic is clear. It's not like I think the announcement yesterday was a 25% tariff on foreign
Automobiles.
automobiles.
Yep.
So it's not like Honda or BMW or whatever just pays the 25% to the US Treasury and takes the hit. They just then increase the price by 25%, and that gets passed on to American consumers. And so this will only increase prices on Americans.
correct. The price on durable goods like that are going to increase. The estimate was somewhere around $4,000 or $5,000 potentially per car,
That's
which
a
is
lot.
It's a
it's a
lot
lot
of
of
money.
money.
It's a lot of money.
There are some exceptions they're talking about for auto parts that are made in the USMCA trade area, so in Canada, Mexico, and that follow certain rules of origin. All right. So if enough of it is made of that intermediate good, that part for your car, is made in the USMCA area, so in one of these three countries, then it would have a lower duty or lower tax on it. But that doesn't mean no tax. It should, considering we're in a free trade agreement through the USMCA. And so this is definitely this is definitely illegal according to that agreement that Trump negotiated and signed, right? So he's fighting against his own rules. But yes, it's going to increase the cost, this one on cars in particular. It's going to increase the cost of new vehicles that are going to market. It's also going to lead to an increase in prices for used vehicles. We saw this in 2021 and 2022 when global supply chains broke down during COVID. A lot of those parts, mostly microchips that went into cars, were on back order. And so the cost of cars increased, and we saw that the cost of used cars jumped a lot. So if you're looking to sell a used car now, or maybe in like a month or so, it's going to be a good time to do it because no one's going to
Okay.
be buying new cars.
So big winners are people selling used cars.
But consumers
Big
are the
losers.
ones getting screwed.
And then
Yeah.
just to put a bow on this, as you see it, essentially the logic, which we'll get to whether it's actually working as planned, but the logic of this is the United States is an enormous market. It's a central player in the global economy, so it wields a lot of economic power and can, in theory, sustain greater pain than other economies can. And so using this as a tool of economic statecraft to bring about policy changes on other issues like fentanyl.
Correct. I
Okay.
think, yes, I think the US can sustain the damage from this a bit more than places like Canada. Canada is very dependent on our market for its exports. Mexico also quite dependent on it. The US consumes a lot. It's one of the reasons why we don't have one of many reasons, but a big reason why we don't have a trade surplus. We buy a lot of stuff. We don't save. If we saved more, then we would see potentially that more of the goods are exported abroad. I think we'll come back to this as well.
Yeah.
But we don't. We consume a lot. And so we have a really big domestic economy that people want to sell their goods to. And those countries, I think, will be hit harder. I think the estimate is that it's going to hurt Canada the most, Mexico the second most. I don't know if there's been estimates about how it's going to hurt Europe, but in our USMCA trade partners are definitely going to be hit hard by it.
Okay.
As are we.
No question. I'd like to double click on a couple things or a couple ideas that you've brought up already. One is reciprocity, right? Because Trump has threatened reciprocal tariffs because he wants better deals. He has argued that the United States has been getting quote unquote screwed by its trading partners, some of which have tariff or non-tariff trade barriers on the United States and not vice versa, right? So I'm interested in whether or not like you could make the argument which he's making. It's like this is unfair, right? It's just fundamentally unfair. We need to change it. It's basically what he's saying and seems to believe,
Mm-hmm.
right? Number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, reindustrialization and whether that is a policy goal. And if so, like whether these policies are likely to result in reindustrialization on a time scale that makes any sense.
Okay, we'll start with the first question. So on the
Yeah.
issue of reciprocity. So the entire trading, so the reason why I study trade as an international relations scholar is it's really one of the only areas in which we can find cooperation at an international level. Right? We don't
Hmm.
do that, right? When we describe international relations, we describe it as an anarchic system where there really is nobody fully in charge of the system. Trade, countries have come together to actually write rules for how the international system works. This was done after World War II to bring countries closer together through the theory that the more you trade with each other, it's kind of Kantian idea, the more you trade with one another, the least likely you are to go to war with one another. So the
Mm-hmm.
entire project of the European Union is founded on having written rules of trade and industrial policy between France and Germany with the steel and coal community. And that then turns into a much wider set of rules called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the GATT, which is just a bunch of bilateral turned into multilateral agreements between countries on the rules of trade. That later turns into the WTO.
Yep.
A main part of this agreement is the idea of reciprocity, right? If you do something, if you are going to reduce your tariffs, I am going to reciprocate that. If you
Mm-hmm.
do something bad to me, I'm going to reciprocate to you in a bad way as well. Right.
Tit
So
for tat, right?
so we put tariffs on goods coming in from Canada. Canada swiftly announced that we're going to retaliate and reciprocate through our own retaliatory tariffs. Trump, again, I think in like I don't even think this is like an 18-year-old me mentality. This is more
A little bit younger
like
than
a
that.
12, like yeah, like a really basic idea of how this idea works. Because reciprocity means like if your country reduces its tariffs on something, we're going to do the same thing, but it might not be on the exact same good, right? If I'm not exporting t-shirts, I don't care what kind of tariff I have on t-shirts, right? T-shirts are not a major good that we produce in the US anymore. If you walk through downtown LA, that used to be the garment center of California.
I'll stop you right there. You can still absolutely buy $65 t-shirts in the
Correct.
United States.
100%. We don't buy those en masse though, right? We're not
Yeah.
going to Costco and buying US made shirts. And so we don't, even though a country may have a really low tariff or sorry, a higher tariff on t-shirts, and we have a very low tariff on t-shirts, that country may have a really low tariff on because we export a lot of services. So that's the reciprocity that most people understand with the international trading system. Trump thinks of it as we need to have reciprocity on every single thing, right? We can't
Got it.
have this issue linkage in terms of trade. And so the US with Canada, we have a major surplus in our exports of services. Think of this as financial services, insurance. Think of this as exporting education. A lot of Canadians come to the US and go to our universities. That's an export of a service. We have a deficit in terms of goods. That's just because we don't produce a ton of stuff here. You know, we produce some stuff, but most of the things that we produce, we consume in this economy. And so his understanding of reciprocity doesn't fully understand that we already have reciprocity in the trading system. It's just not how he wants to see it.
He wants a one-to-one relationship. And it's like
Correct.
an eye for an eye, like one-to-one category of goods. And like there's what, like thousands of categories that you can do this across. So it's like the administrative burden is very high, as I understand it, which is
Yep.
why it's taking months to like figure out how to do this because nobody knows how to do it anymore.
This idea that the US is getting screwed by everybody else, totally unfounded. The idea that the US is getting screwed on certain aspects of trade, very much founded. And I think we'll come back to that when we talk about reindustrialization. Other countries are using industrial policy that is having an effect on the US economy. And that is the way to really fight against this, is to use a similar type of policy. This is some 19th century BS. Like, this is
Yeah.
not the way to fight this war.
And I mean, piggybacking on this, the countries don't have to respond in kind to whatever tariffs the US is imposing. They can then impose tariffs on stuff the US really wants to export.
Which I love. It's smart. This is good for young political scientists studying. Like, to be a good political scientist, it's not just understanding your own country, but understanding how other political systems work. And so, like, the Canadians, super smart. The Europeans, super smart. They know where to retaliate. They're retaliating in districts that are heavily supportive of Trump or that are going to have really difficult fights in the midterm elections, or are districts that are held by leadership. Right. So back in the 2000s, when W. Bush put steel tariffs on, the EU hit back in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida. He removed those tariffs right away because he knew he had a re-election coming up and he needed to win those states. Right. They know what they're doing. They hit
states.
Harley Davidson. Yeah. Like, of course. It's genius.
I actually had totally forgotten that episode, but yeah, you reminded me. Yeah, he pulled them back pretty quickly, if I recall. I did want to build on or ask a question that builds on this and gets to Steve mentioning reindustrialization. The way that this has been framed, and if I were putting kind of like the best face on it as one consequence of globalization or the neoliberal turn, which I'm going to be annoying and be an academic and pack like 5 questions into this question. But
it's all right. He's used to it.
Get my marker out.
Yeah. If you want to talk a little bit about what neoliberalism means, because I find it to be like a very slippery and debated term. Well, the way it's being framed is sort of, yes, trade has brought down prices for American consumers. There's been plenty of benefits, but there have been winners and losers from trade. Manufacturing in the United States has somewhat been hollowed out. This has been like a major topic of political discussion going back a decade now, at least. So I guess I'm curious, like, what is their theory of the case as to why this approach might help deal with some of those problems? And basically every economist I've read predicts this isn't going to work. So what is the logic behind the fact that this probably isn't going to go the way that they're envisioning?
Gotcha. Okay, so the general understanding of neoliberalism is it's all about free markets. You need to, release the shackles of the government from business and let business do its thing. Right? Going back to Adam Smith, having these free markets is going to be the best way to grow your economy. Right? So the opposite of a Marxist mentality where the government can do things to right those wrongs from free trade, from open markets, open capital markets, et cetera. And this is how both parties saw the best way for the US economy and foreign economies to move forward, really since like the 1980s, right? This is a battle during the Cold War, but it's really not until we have Reagan that we have a full-fledged fight for neoliberalism, right? Reducing income taxes, Reagan does this. Reducing regulation, so less regulation for a lot of businesses. Reagan does that, Thatcher does that. Pushing this on other economies. This is what the IMF begins to do. The IMF gets a bad name in the 70s and 80s because for countries to get relief from the International Monetary Fund, they have to enact these neoliberal ideas of reducing taxes, privatizing state utilities, state-owned oil companies, state electricity companies, all should be privatized. This is being pushed by the US through what was deemed or called the Washington Consensus, but was done through international institutions like the International Monetary Fund. During this time, there's also, there's one thing that all economists agree on, which is that free trade is good. It's generally welfare improving. And when I say welfare, I don't mean, getting money from the government for being poor or for other reasons. Welfare improving means it's good for the entire society in the aggregate. Can't find a single economist that disagrees with that, right? That's a general understanding of free trade. But as you said, Galen, there are winners and losers. In 2016, when Trump won, I was at the International Political Economy Society annual meeting. It's like it's like those conferences that you guys have been to. And Helen Milner, who was in charge of that, came up and she gave the opening remarks. And this is like 3 days after Trump was elected. And, we're all still in shock, but she says, we all knew this, right? We've been studying this idea, these things that Trump has been talking about for years. We know that free trade is good, but there's winners and losers, and the losers have been, kind of screwed. And we saw how they voted. And that's the biggest issue. From the 80s until really Donald Trump, both parties were pretty neoliberal, right? If you look at the candidates that the Democrats put up for president, Barack Obama was, left of center. Hillary Clinton, left of center. These are not progressives in any way, shape, or form. The most progressive thing that Barack Obama did was the healthcare law, but even that wasn't progressive enough for most progressives. All right, so pretty much both parties are in bed with this idea of neoliberalism. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are really the first ones to be vocal about this thing and to say that, hey, you're getting screwed. I always tell my students at Villanova, it's kind of a relatively conservative place. I love telling them this. Trump is a Marxist, right? He talks, the way he talks this is Marxism. He's saying that corporations have been screwing you. The way he talks is, people are losing and you all have been screwed. But again, as someone who studies this, we've known this for years. It's just the issue is both Democrats and Republicans have been terrible, absolutely terrible about helping out those who are screwed by globalization, right? With the signing of NAFTA, there was Ross Perot saying you can hear the sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico, right? It's a very thing that you can.
Yeah, I think people forget too. I mean, like, I don't think he won any states. Like, I don't think he won any electoral votes, but he won like 15% of the popular vote.
As
like,
a third-party candidate, is a significant amount. People really responded to that. And this is why people, and people responded to Bernie Sanders for this reason, right? They saw that he was speaking to them, right? People in rural Ohio supported this idea of Bernie Sanders. Look at Sherrod Brown, like he was supported by labor unions, right? These are important things. So Democrats and Republicans have been terrible about it. Trump brought this into the national conversation. Like I said before, Trump's stated goal hasn't actually met his means of getting there. If you remember the first administration, what did he do to help workers? The only major thing he did in his first 2 years was passing a major tax cut for millionaires and billionaires, right? It's a massive tax cut, put a $10 trillion hole in our deficit over the next 10 years. What it also did is it shifted a ton of jobs overseas. A lot of pharmaceutical jobs, then a lot of that production went overseas and a lot of revenue went with it because of this tax law. All right, so that did nothing. Also, if you really cared about bringing jobs back, what you need to do is you need to shore up your deficit. If we had a surplus rather than a deficit, that would be matched on the other side of a ledger, our accounting ledger, with a trade surplus as well, right? The countries that save the most also export the most, right? The US, I think, is like a savings rate of like around like 19%, right? Whereas countries like China, major trade surplus, has a savings rate of like 40%. Germany, slightly higher than the US, about 25%. Most countries that export a lot also save a lot. And so the things that he could be doing to get to, helping out those who have lost, he's doing it incorrectly. Now, back to the reindustrialization part. Joe Biden was finally the president that was doing that. I was very happy to see, yes, the IRA, which was an unfortunate name, but it made sense at the time to get it passed, just has nothing to do with inflation. It really had to do with reindustrialization. So industrialization or industrial policy in this neoliberal era from the 1980s until really 2016, actually I'd say 2020, was seen as faux pas. that it's not in the government's business to try to pick winners and losers. The government's bad at it. The example that Republicans always bring up is Solenn.
Yep.
Right. So do you guys remember this? Okay.
2009, the like energy company that was part of the stimulus package, and they
Yes.
wielded it like a cudgel against Obama for like 8
Yep.
years. Yeah.
Yep.
I do
They
remember.
found a way to build solar cells using, I think it was using sand. It was a way of producing solar cells that didn't rely on fossil fuels. So this made sense when fossil fuel prices were high. When fossil fuel prices dipped because the huge explosion of fracking, all of a sudden Solyndra didn't make sense anymore. Right? Oil prices stayed high, they would have been fine. But Republicans use this, as you said, as a cudgel against using industrial policy. So really industrial policy stopped. The IRA gets it going again, and it's just massive amounts of money into industries that we know produce a lot of jobs, right? So things in renewable energy, a ton of expansion in that. The microchips that we use in our electronics, bringing bringing TSMC into major investments. They're not going to do that without, major support from the government. They can much easier do that in Taiwan than do it here. All right, so that is the type of policy that's going to get companies to base here and to support workers. So back to Europe. BMW's biggest manufacturing plant in the world is not in Bavaria. It's not in Stuttgart. It's in South Carolina, right? They already have moved production here, right? This started in the 1980s. They started moving production here, a lot of these companies. Japan started doing that in the 1980s with the Plaza Accord, right? It made more sense to produce here than it did to try to ship those goods overseas. And so now most of those cars are already made here, right? A lot of them, but they're still getting parts from overseas. And so because we have that huge tariff on the auto parts and not just the import of the car, it's going to be hurting those people and also then hurting those workers.
So would you say if you're serious about reindustrialization or bringing jobs back from overseas, helping out people who are hit the hardest by the neoliberal turn, it would be something like the IRA, basically government investment in kind of critical sectors, whether that's for national security or other reasons? Like that would actually be, if you're serious about doing this, the way to go?
Yeah, so that's one part of it. The other part is actually, so that would be a way of reindustrializing and make sure we're creating jobs. The other way is we need to figure out how to deal with those who have lost jobs, right? Those who are losing their jobs they used to vote for Democrats, are now voting for Republicans. There is a system in place to deal with them. It's just we do a really bad job of it. So the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, I think it was started under Nixon, is a way to get money to individuals who have lost their jobs because of globalization. Right? So if you are in the textile manufacturing industry in Los Angeles, you as an individual could get money through this program. Think of it as a transfer from those who won from globalization to those who are losing from globalization. And you can use that money then for job retraining. Most often, that money has been either slow to get to people or hasn't gotten to people. Or if they get the money, it's going to be for stated goals. So you have to use this for job retraining. It's not often used to like relocate people, right? If you're in an area that was just manufacturing furniture, like in North Carolina, one small town is just manufacturing furniture. All of a sudden, China imports a bunch of stuff. You all lose your jobs. Who's going to want to move? Like, you have your whole life there. But maybe if you have some money, there's a potential to. The issue, I think, with a lot of assistance programs in the US is we don't do a good job of giving people dignity in those transfers. We don't give them just cash transfer. Like, here is money. You know what's best for you and your family in the situation. You should deal with it as you see fit. There's tons of evidence in development economics that shows that cash transfer programs work very well. Universal income programs work very well. But the way that we do it in the US is usually like, here is money for you to go to your local community college to learn a new craft. And that's it. That's not going to be very helpful for someone living in a rural area trying to find a different job. So I think that would also play into it, right? So it's the big investment through industrial policy, but also figuring out better ways to deal with those who are losing out from trade.
Thank you.
Hey, you're
That
welcome,
makes
pal.
sense. Yeah. All right. We've absorbed a lot of wisdom on this subject. I guess the next question I have is, what do you think is going to happen as a result of these tariffs?
It's a small question.
I know it might take us through the rest of our time, but I
Well,
think it's
I have
important to
one
ask.
more. So if
Okay, you want to ask
if you
yours
could,
first?
no, you just lobbed in. I just spare 5 for my question.
All right.
I don't know if we can get to that in 5 minutes. So when Trump, so there's, there's like months between the election and when Trump comes into office. In that time, he's issuing memorandums, and people in the trade policy community were thinking, we're going to be okay. It looks like things are going to be slow with these tariffs. If he does have tariffs, it's going to be a few months from now, which allows people to figure out ways around it. But then he came in early February and said basically like, on Monday, I'm doing this. And it
Right.
took everybody by surprise, even people in his administration by surprise. And then sometimes in the exact same day, he had put in place tariffs and then removed them.
Yep.
And then he says, with Canada and Mexico, I will suspend these for 30 days while they put in place the policies that they said they were going to put in place, and which they were doing. But it's hard to get a full, army on the border to try to stop individuals from coming into the US in 30 days. But they were making moves towards the things that he wanted. So nobody really knows what's going to happen with Trump from day to day. And the biggest issue for me, as I see it for my students, and I think for Galen with his students, is there's so much uncertainty right now that the job market is going to be absolutely abysmal come summertime. There's already been an announcement. There was a bunch of leaders in business were surveyed recently by CNN. They did a poll, and 1 in 4 have said that they're doing a hiring freeze across the board. So they're not going to be hiring in the next year or years because they don't. Uncertainty is so high. Uncertainty is as high as it is right now, as it was back in 2020 when we were being hit by a global pandemic and we had no idea what was going on. That was an exogenous shock. This is endogenous. This is something created by the Trump administration, causing all sorts of uncertainty. No one knows what's going to happen. We don't know in universities what's going to happen, right? We don't know what's happening with funding, right? Galen and I, there's funding available for the research we do. A lot of that's been shut down. It's gone.
Yeah, maybe.
The Minerva program, I submitted a grant for that. It's millions of dollars that's given by Congress to the DoD to do research on things that matter for the military. It's all gone. So you don't know what's going to happen. There's uncertainty everywhere. And so what's going to happen? I have no idea. All I know is I presume there's going to be a recession.
Yep.
And if Jerome Powell keeps his job, I don't think we're going to go into a stagflationary period like we saw in the 1970s and 80s when you have really high unemployment and really high inflation, right? A stagnant economy with really high inflation.
Pure misery, right?
Pure misery. But the only way to fight that inflation is through an independent central bank. Jerome Powell is still the head of the Federal Reserve. He's still independent. But when his term comes up, which I think is next year, he is not going to be reappointed, most likely.
And I was going to say, I don't get the sense Trump likes him very much. So
no,
Trump
he won't do what he
low
wants.
Interest rates.
Yeah. He wants low interest rates. I would imagine that Kid Rock will do a great job as Fed chairman.
Here's there's more irony here.
More.
So there's more. Trump wants low interest rates, right? He really wants to have lower interest rates, but we can't because we still have high inflation. As prices go up, interest rates have to go up with it to fight inflation, right? So Trump's stated goal of having lower interest rates to make this a better investment environment, it's not going to happen. Moreover, with those interest rates going up, because the Fed is going to have to raise them to deal with these increased prices, is going to put pressure on the US dollar to increase even more.
Yeah.
So Trump wants a lower exchange rate, and it's not going to happen because of these policies.
You're describing macroeconomics 101, maybe 102, basically.
And I mean, it doesn't help debt payments, which the United States has in abundance at this point, to
Yes.
have
Correct.
high interest rates either.
Yeah, if you want to bring
Um,
prices down, you need like absolute free trade.
well,
Who
all right. Now,
says? Yeah, go ahead.
since we're getting to this, is kind of a nice segue. I mean, the United States has been the center of the international economic system basically since the end of the Second World War. I mean, it's, I'd say, not a hot take at this point to say the rest of the world is looking at what's happening here with a lot of concern and deep uncertainty. I mean, what do you think the prospects are as a result of all this for some sort of really massive structural changes in how the international economy works, whether people start looking, hey, China is a huge market, maybe that's a better bet, maybe, fundamental stuff like the dollar is the reserve currency, or is that kind of far enough away from this topic that it's not as relevant in your mind?
So there's two things there. So we'll start with the dollar as a reserve currency. So the dollar has been the global reserve currency since really after the First World War, but it really takes off with the Bretton Woods system set up after World War II. Right? The US wrote the rules, right? All the rules that we have in the international financial system, it's really written by the US, but in cooperation with its allies. Those allies don't really seem like allies according to the Trump administration. So to have a major restructuring of things, we need to have cooperation. There's no cooperation. Trump doesn't seem to care about cooperation. He cares about bilateral issues. To get everybody on board, you have to have multilateral cooperation. Trump, for some reason that I don't understand, is very concerned with bilateral trade relationships. It's not the way the world works, right? We don't just trade with Canada. We don't just trade with Mexico. We're all intertwined in this major network, right? The pieces for, back to the iPhone, the pieces for the iPhone are coming from all over the world, right? You have it designed in Cupertino. You have pieces coming from Japan, South Korea, from Taiwan, from Germany, from more from the US, right? And all these things are being put into a single product. And so this idea that trade is all bilateral, again, is like this 19th century idea of how the world works. All right. So Trump is still in that mindset. So that was the trade part. What was the first part of the question?
I mean, sort of just like, what do you rank as that we were talking about the dollar as the reserve currency?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. The dollar as reserve currency. So the question about the dollar as a reserve currency is what would be put in place if the dollar is no longer the reserve currency? And there really isn't another global leader. All right, the US dollar is still about 55% of the currencies that are being held in central banks. China has increased quite a bit, 300% it's increased over the last decade, but that's from 1% to 3%. All right, so China,
Yeah,
the renminbi, the yuan is not a major player in global reserve currencies.
they would have to release currency controls in order to
Correct.
make a play for this. The only
And
other
they're
candidate remaining is the euro. Is that right?
exactly. The only other candidate that are remaining is the euro, but the euro doesn't seem to have a desire for it to be a global reserve currency. It's not there. They haven't made that stated goal, nor do I think they will. Right? They already have enough political issues keeping this thing together to then put those constraints on them by becoming the global reserve currency. I don't it's not going to pass muster with these domestic economies, right? So the US dollar is still probably going to be the reserve currency, which is still going to be a major issue for Donald Trump. Again, because people need those dollars for transactions. They need it to manage their own exchange rates. And so money is always going to be flooding into the United States, especially as interest rates go up, which they will because of the tariffs. And then the first part of your question, Galen, sorry, I forgot to write this one down.
I mean, you sort of got there. I mean, I was basically asking you the prospects for a serious restructuring, whether the Chinese market becomes like an alternative spot. I mean, I did just want to mention, this gets to your point about the administration's policy sort of working at cross purposes. I mean, my understanding is they still really like that the US has all of these advantages that come from the dollar being the reserve currency, but kind of can't
Correct.
really understand how these two things work at cross purposes.
Yes, exactly. So there's so many positive things that are happening because we have this reserve currency. The ability to bully other countries, bully Iran, which they like. Previously, they liked the Biden administration liked the ability to bully Russia. Trump administration, clearly not as much.
Sanctions work way better when you have the reserve currency, right?
Correct. And
Yeah.
Other countries would have no problem doing the same thing to the US that we've done to all of them for years, right?
Yeah.
No problem. But again, what currency would stand in? And then back to the idea of like, is this some big grand strategy of the Trump administration to restructure the entire international system? Let's imagine that it is, that they are playing like 15-dimensional chess.
Oh.
One, I don't think they are. Two,
No
I
argument.
don't think Trump has the stamina for it. Come 2026, the midterm elections, if inflation's still high and we're still in these trade wars, they're going to lose massively. And they're not going to be able to put forward any sort of agenda. They're not going to win in 2028. He's not going to win. And it's going to take not only a lot of time to restructure these things, but also cooperation. In order to get a restructuring, you need cooperation. The Plaza Accord in 1985 with Reagan occurs because West Germany, France, Japan all agree that the US trade deficit is getting to be too much and that it's being hurt by these economies having relatively undervalued exchange rates relative to the US. And so the US negotiates with them to decrease the US dollar in value relative to these countries to increase our ability to export goods abroad. No country is going to do that right now. No one's going to bow down to Trump to do this. And so without cooperation, there's no way to restructure this.
Right. So what you're saying is he has painted himself and us into a corner with no way out other than undoing all the things that he's done in the space of 2 months, which I suppose he or somebody else could do.
Well,
right?
the other piece of that Ryan alluded to, I mean, at a certain point, if all of these things go as they seem to be going, I'm quite skeptical about grand theories of American politics because it just all seems insane to me. But one reliable thing seems to be pocketbook voting. And so maybe that will be the ultimate correction.
Yeah, it will probably have to be. Yeah, the thermostatic nature of American politics, right? All right. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. I feel like we could talk about this for another 4 hours, most likely.
Yeah, I'm just getting started. I'm heated.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to listen to Ryan like spit wisdom, man. This is awesome.
Magisterial work, Ryan. And it's great to see you again. Thank you for dropping knowledge on us.
Yeah, thanks, man. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Good to see you guys.
Yeah. And we'll have you back on soon, man.
That'll be fun. Looking forward to it.
All right. For all of us here at Global Tantrum, goodbye. Thank you.